Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to give people another minute or two to join us, and then we'll get started. Okay, it's about 3:30, so we'll get started. Good afternoon. My name is Jen Saponis, and I am the Director of Regional Planning for the Capital District Transportation Committee. Today on this webinar, we also have Andrew Tracy from Cdtc and Stephen Maples from Cdtc. And then we also have two panelists from Greenman-Pedersen. We have Ryan Walsh and Chris Cornwell. So this is a webinar that's part of our New Visions virtual learning series, and we've titled it Pedestrian Safety Solutions, Selecting Locations for Rectangular Rapid Flashing Beacons, but we'll also be covering some other pedestrian crossing safety solutions. This is a webinar, so we cannot see the participants, but you can see us, and you are muted. And we ask that you stay muted, but if you have any questions or comments for myself or the panelists throughout the webinar, please use the chat or the Q&A function. And this webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded to the Cdtc YouTube channel. So our webinar has been approved by the Upstate APA chapter for CM credits. So if you are AICP, you can earn 1 credit for attending today's webinar, and we will provide attendance certificates. Also, if you are from a planning or zoning board and your municipality has approved Cdtc as webinars to count towards training credits. It counts towards the New York State Department of State training requirements for planning and zoning boards, and municipalities can approve our webinars. So if you are from a planning or zoning board or other type of town or city council, and you're interested in more information about New Visions or about our webinars, please reach out and let us know, or reach out to Department of State for more information on getting them approved. So each month we feature a different topic in our New Visions or our Metropolitan Transportation Plan, and provide planners, engineers, and officials with tools and resources for integrating our principles and best practices into local plans and projects. For September, our webinar is going to focus on electrification of the transportation system. So there's a typo there. It's supposed to be said by 2050, planning tools for electrifying transportation. And it'll give an overview of our regional EV and zero emissions plan. So on the Cdtc website, you can find previous webinars. They're all been recorded. We upload them to our YouTube channel, but they're also embedded on our New Visions website. Again, in addition to the videos, you'll find links to the executive summary for our Metropolitan Transportation Plan, New Visions 2050, and the other materials related to it. So for today's agenda, I'll provide a really short overview of CDTC's Metropolitan Transportation Plan. And then we're gonna pass it to Andrew Tracy, who will talk about our RRFBs and other bicycle and pedestrian crossing treatments and how you can choose the right treatment for your site. And then we'll have Chris and Ryan talk about bicycle and pedestrian crossings, different applications from throughout the Capital District. And then we'll conclude with a brief overview of available planning safety planning resources at CDTC, and then we'll go to questions and discussion. So one of CDTC's major products is our Metropolitan Transportation Plan, which we refer to as New Visions 2050. And New Visions 2050 is a blueprint for regional transportation that reflects a shared vision for the future. Who is the vision shared by? This plan was developed in coordination with transportation providers, local governments, state agencies, and even private sector stakeholders, and of course the public. And this plan prioritizes what funding and federal investment decisions are made throughout the MPO process here at CDTC. Whoa. Can you see my next slide? Okay, sorry about that. And you may be wondering what implementation of a Metropolitan Transportation Plan looks like. These are just some examples of major infrastructure investments that have been constructed because of the priorities and strategies laid out in previous Metropolitan Transportation Plans. So these include, of course, our bus rapid transit system that has been expanding every year, our extensive regional trail network, and some other major projects such as roundabouts, the Exit 3 Airport Connector, the replacement of the Rexford Bridge, and even the Madison Avenue Road Diet in Albany. There are a lot of challenges in developing a Metropolitan Transportation Plan. We refer to it as a living document. We are continuously checking in with it, and we update it every 5 years. Some of the existing and upcoming challenges that we see, of course, are advanced technologies like autonomous vehicles, making sure that we are investing equitably in the system and the region, the electrification of transportation, the ongoing climate crisis, new mobility disruption and how it impacts transportation. So that refers to like the Ubers and Lyfts or bike share, scooters, or some of the other new types of personal mobility like one wheels and electric skateboards and stuff. Funding uncertainty, and I mentioned emerging technologies, but it does go beyond autonomous vehicles, but to how can we integrate advanced technologies like sensors or cameras in ways that are not harmful to people. And then of course, the increasing cost of constructing new infrastructure and maintaining even what we have. So we implement new visions also through our other planning work, through our Unified Planning Work Program, which is basically our tasks and budget for the year, and the Transportation Improvement Program, which is the 5-year capital program. More information about new visions can be found on our website. We'd be happy to provide training or presentations on new visions, or just provide more information on topics within new visions to anyone who's interested. You can visit us at cdtcmpo.org. You can go directly to the New Visions webpage with that /NV2050, or you can email me. So with that, I'm going to pass it to Andrew.
Okay, thank you very much, Jennifer. One moment while I share my screen. Okay, can you see my title slide?
Yes, yes.
Okay, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. Today I will be discussing RRFBs, rectangular rapid flashing beacons, and other bicycle and pedestrian crossing treatments, and how to select the right treatment for the right site. brief overview of the presentation. We're going to be focusing on uncontrolled crossings today, non-intersection crossings or mid-block crossings. So these are defined as crossings that do not have any stop control or yield signs or a traffic signal, such as the example pictured here in East Greenbush. We're going to be discussing RRFBs and a suite of other crossing treatments recommended by FHWA. RRFBs are appropriate for some, but not all crossings, and there are a suite of other treatments that should be used in conjunction with RRFBs as well, even when they're deployed. But first, we're going to take a quick look through all of the planning and design guidance resources that are available, starting with the FHWA, the Federal Highway Administration's STEP program. So this is Safe Transportation for Every Pedestrian. I've got a link to each resource on each slide, so I'll see if we can share our slides afterwards, so you can click on all these links. But the STEP program is part of Federal Highway's Everyday Counts program. And as part of Everyday Counts, FHWA has highlighted various innovations, and the STEP program is a collection of innovations for improving bicycle and pedestrian safety. And the STEP webpage has resources for all aspects of pedestrian safety, not just RRFBs or uncontrolled crossings. It's very broad. And they also host very helpful 2-page tech sheets for all the treatments we'll be talking about today, including RRFBs, along with local case studies and a lot more information. So I definitely recommend checking out FHWA's STEP website when you're able. The main resource that I'll be drawing from my slides is a lengthy and detailed report that was prepared by FHWA as part of the STEP program, and it's called the Guide for Improving Pedestrian Safety at Uncontrolled Crossing Locations. So this report has a recommended 6-step process to follow for first identifying which uncontrolled crossing sites are appropriate for safety countermeasures, and then selecting the appropriate countermeasures for those sites. So as I mentioned, RRFBs are often an appropriate countermeasure, but not always. And there are certain cases where you don't want to use them and you want to use different treatments instead. So we'll get into that a bit later on. FHWA has also published an outstanding resource called Step Studio. And this is also hosted on the STEP website, the Safe Transportation for Every Pedestrian website. And it's an interactive PDF document that guides you through the 6-step process that I'll be talking about briefly today. But for every step in the process, the Step Studio has interactive links that you can click through, and it has a lot of great charts and graphs and diagrams, and I'll be showing you some of them today in my slides. So if I cover something very quickly, you'll want to refer to the Step Studio to click on the step you're interested in to do a deep dive and get more information. And another resource that I'll be drawing from for my slides is the Empire State Trail Design Guide. I won't be showing too many pages from the guide, but it's important to know that they have guidance on shared use path crossings and for on-road trail facility crossings. And this was the guidance document that was prepared for the build out of the Empire State Trail. Pictured there on the right is an example page from the design guide relating to specifically to RRFBs. So there's a lot of great information on that and other trail crossing treatments in the Empire State Trail Design Guide. And I will also be drawing from some state level guidance as well, issued by New York State DOT. So back in, I believe, originally 2015, and then they updated it in 2018, but they issued a traffic safety and mobility instruction memo, pictured there on the left. And this memo relates specifically to implementation of RRFBs, when they should be used. This memo summarizes the MUTCD interim guidance on RRFBs as well. And this memo draws a lot of information from national best practices. It specifically cites the city of Boulder, Colorado's pedestrian crossing treatment installation guidelines as a national best practice. It's a little old now. It's from 2011, but it's still commonly cited in a lot of guidance, planning and design guidance documents as a national standard. So you can find the Boulder, Colorado report on NACTO's website. And as I mentioned, all these links that you're seeing, I'll endeavor to share my slides at the end, so you can click on the links directly as well. And finally, the resource that the last resource I will draw from today is the MUTCD, the Manual of Uniform Traffic Control Devices. This is the federal regulations that cover all traffic control devices, from stop signs to yield signs to pavement markings and traffic signals and everything else. RRFBs specifically are not mentioned in the most recent MUTCD, which is the 2009 edition. However, they were granted interim approval for use out in the field by Federal Highway, by US DOT back in 2008. So the MUTCD's interim guidance, it's pretty brief, but it describes, what an RRFB should look like and how it should operate. And it describes the use cases, but in very, very broad terms. It just says that they must be pedestrian actuated, though I believe later on GPI will show us some examples from elsewhere in the country where they're experimenting with having camera actuated RRFBs as well. The MUTCD also says that RRFBs must supplement but not replace the required warning signage at the uncontrolled crossings. And some of those warning signs are pictured here on the slide. And it goes on to say they should only be used, they must only be used at uncontrolled crossings. So you can't place these at a four-way stop or at an intersection. They need to be at a mid-block crossing. Like I said, they should not be used at yield signs, stop signs, traffic signals, or in conjunction with hawk signals, AKA pedestrian hybrid beacons, which we'll discuss a little later on as well. So the US DOT was required in the most recent transportation bill, the bipartisan infrastructure law. US DOT was required to update the MUTCD by May of 2023. And RRFBs are expected to be covered in more detail as a part of that. So better guidance than the MUTCD is coming. So now I'm going to walk through the 6-step process that's recommended by Federal Highway Administration in their report, the Guide for Improving Pedestrian Safety at Uncontrolled Crossing Locations. I'm going to very briefly cover all 6 steps, but I encourage you to refer to the full document if you really want to see details. The first step that they recommend is to collect data and engage the public. And specifically, they recommend doing pedestrian crash data collection, which you can do through tools such as Alice, or now the Clear Crash Data Viewer that NICE hosts. They also recommend reviewing any existing highway safety action plans, initiating a local pedestrian safety action plan, reviewing existing pedestrian safety policies for your jurisdiction. And they go on to recommend doing a public input phase and conducting walkability audits as well. And I am going to touch on some of these bullet points in a bit more detail, specifically relating to existing highway safety plans. The Cdtc planning area, which is the 4-county planning area, Albany, Schenectady, Saratoga, and Rensselaer counties. This planning area is covered by the Cdtc Local Road Safety Action Plan, which was completed in 2019. And many of the step 1 bullet points that we saw on the prior slide were covered, at least at the regional level, in the Local Road Safety Action Plan. So this report included bicycle and pedestrian crash screening. There was a lot of data analysis a lot of charts and graphs relating to where the crashes occur, when they occur, and what the contributing factors are, along with a list of strategies and actions for improving bike ped safety. So this is a good first step. And if you're from a local jurisdiction, you may want to do similar analysis, but at the scale of your municipality or county or your smaller jurisdiction. Some local jurisdictions around the state have pedestrian safety action plans as well, or they're considering initiating them. And this can be a good place to do some of these step 1 and step 2 of the FHWA's recommended 6-step process for uncontrolled crossing safety. Relating specifically to public involvement in walkability audits, FHWA has a lot of great resources to help with this. In conjunction with NHTSA, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, FHWA developed this walkability audit one-page survey. So these can be handed out as part of a public outreach process, or if you organize community walkability audits, these can be handed out to the participants. This is just a short survey that you can use to broadly screen your network, collect data in many different uncontrolled crossings, and get local feedback on where people feel comfortable walking, where they feel uncomfortable walking, where they feel, improvements to uncontrolled crossing safety may be warranted. So this can be a first good step for public involvement for better informing site selection. The second step in the 6-step process is to inventory conditions and prioritize locations. Federal Highway recommends that you build out an inventory of your roadway characteristics and your pedestrian crossings, both your existing crossings at intersections, but also mid-block crossings as well, in places where you're considering building uncontrolled crossings. This is a step that Cdtc can help you with. We have access to a lot of resources such as the New York State Roadway Information System, which has information such as traffic volumes and number of lanes on every roadway. And this is a good place to go for a first step screening to build out your inventory of local roadway characteristics. Federal Highway also recommends doing crash safety analysis, two types of crash safety analysis. The cluster analysis or hotspot analysis, but also systemic analysis as well. So I'll very briefly explain the difference. You can, and this is also something that Cdtc can help with as well, but you pull all of the pedestrian and bicycle related crashes for your jurisdiction for the last 3 or 5 or 10 years. And you want to look at the data in 2 different ways. The first way is the crash cluster analysis, also known as the hotspot analysis. And this is the traditional way where you map where all of your crashes occur and you look for hotspots where they occur more than they should. And this is a good way of identifying, identifying the hotspots that should be prioritized for pedestrian safety improvements. This will generally include a lot of intersections, but it can include mid-block sections as well. And this is a good first step to do, but it doesn't cover all of your crashes. So it's very, very importantly, crashes, especially pedestrian crashes, they're random in nature. They change from year to year. They're infrequent compared to vehicle crashes. So doing this hotspot analysis, it'll highlight some intersections of concern usually, but if you only look at that, you'll only be looking at about half the crashes that occur. And the other crashes occur kind of randomly spread out over the network, and they shift from year to year. And so because of that, it's helpful to also do a systemic analysis where you use the crash cluster analysis to identify risk factors, which I'll get into on the next slide in a bit more detail. And then you look for locations on your network where those risk factors are present. And then you say, these are good locations to build improvements. Whether or not we observe any crashes, they still have the risk factors. So even if we got lucky and there wasn't a crash this year, it still has an elevated chance for a bicycle or pedestrian involved crash. So Federal Highway recommends that you do both the crash cluster and the systemic analysis to cover your whole network. Systemic crash risk factors can include high traffic volumes, of course, long distance between marked crossings. If you're standing on the road and the nearest marked crossing is a quarter mile in each direction, then you're going to try to cross right where you are. Multiple lanes, or more generally, a longer pedestrian crossing distance can be another risk factor. High speed of traffic, dark or sparsely lit crossings, and also crossings that are near land uses such as college campuses, apartments, things that are pedestrian activity generators. These can all be systemic risk factors. More information, if you really want to do a deep dive, there's a great NCHRP report specifically on systemic pedestrian safety analysis. The link is on the slide on the right there if you want to take a more detailed look. But it's important to look at the crashes that are occurring in your jurisdiction and to identify what your local risk factors are, and then to identify which locations have these risk factors present. And these make good locations, candidate locations for RRFBs or other crossing treatments. And finally, one of the last things I'll say on the topic of location selection, it's important that the location you choose to install a new uncontrolled crossing has adequate sight distance for vehicles to stop. If it's on a curve, for example, that may be a very poor area, because even if you have an RRFB or even a full traffic signal that's pedestrian actuated, if oncoming traffic doesn't have the appropriate stopping distance, then all the safety countermeasures in the world, might not help you. So Federal Highway has published guidance on stopping sight distances. This is very site specific, though. You'll want to work with an engineering firm to determine what the appropriate sight distance is based on the observed speed of traffic. But even at 25 miles per hour, they recommend at least 155 feet of stopping distance for uncontrolled crossing locations. Some treatments such as setbacks, clearing vegetation, implementing parking restrictions, or curb extensions that reduce the crossing sight distance, these can all help. But if the site does not have adequate stopping sight distance, then Federal Highway just recommends instead trying to get pedestrians to cross at another crossing at the nearby intersections, for example. The third step I won't cover in too much detail. Step 3 is analyzing your crash types and safety issues. We covered a lot of this on prior slides. Federal Highway recommends you make crash diagrams, identify crash factors, and they also recommend conducting pedestrian road safety assessments or road safety audits. And this is something that can be very helpful. I've been involved in a number of road safety assessments in the past, and there's no substitute for walking the road yourself and experiencing the conditions for yourself, especially if you haven't been a pedestrian in the area of concern before. A road safety assessment generally involves getting a group of stakeholders together, including planners, engineers, police are often involved, elected officials, any other local stakeholders that are interested, and actually going out and walking all these areas that you've identified as areas of pedestrian safety concern, and documenting the findings in a report as well. So this is a great tool for ground truthing all of the screening data that you've collected before, and it can really help whittle down sites to prioritize for crossing implementation. Moving on to step 4 out of 6, and this is where we'll really dive into RRFBs and other treatments. Selecting the right countermeasure. So there's no single set of countermeasures that's a Swiss Army knife that applies to every site. Different sites have different recommended countermeasures. There are 9 in total that Federal Highway lists in their guide for improving pedestrian safety at uncontrolled crossing locations, and here's the list. at every location, regardless of the number of lanes or the speed of traffic or any other factors, they always recommend these high visibility crosswalk improvements listed here. The other treatments are raised crosswalks, advanced yield to or stop for pedestrian signage, in-street pedestrian crossing signs, curb extensions or curb bump outs. You know, you can use these at intersections. You can use them mid-block or at uncontrolled crossing sections as well. Pedestrian refuge islands, which I won't discuss much, but GPI will show you some examples of those in their slides a little later on. RRFBs, rectangular rapid flashing beacons, road diets, and finally pedestrian hybrid beacons, aka hawk signals as well. So Federal Highway, as part of their step guidance, put together this chart, which is a little overwhelming to look at first, but I'll walk you through it. Based on the roadway configuration in terms of number of lanes, which is listed here on the left, traffic volume, which is listed across the top, and the speed of the traffic, the speed limit as well. FHWA recommends a certain suite of treatments that applies to that site. So if you have a location of concern, you can look first at the number of lanes here on the left, and then you can follow that row across, choose the traffic volume bin that you fall into, as well as the speed limit bin as well. And then now that'll direct you to one of the boxes on the slide here. And then you look at the corresponding numbers down below to see which suite of treatments is appropriate for that site. If the number is circled, that recommends that this specific treatment should always occur. If the number is circled with the black circle here, it means that treatment, that countermeasure should always be considered, but you know, some engineering judgment may be involved in determining if it's right for that site. And if the number is not circled, then it's a candidate treatment, and you know, it should be considered, but it's a lower priority than the circled treatments. So as an example, imagine a 3-lane roadway, travel lane in each direction, left turn lane down the middle, with 10,000 AADT and a speed limit of 35 miles per hour. We find the corresponding cell here on the chart, which I've circled in red. We see the numbers 135, 679. So for this particular site, Federal Highway recommends the suite of visibility enhancements, high visibility crosswalk paint, parking restrictions to improve crosswalk visibility, lighting, crossing warning signage. You'll notice the number of 1 is in every cell here, so it's always recommended. They also recommend for this particular roadway, advanced warning signage, curb extensions as well. You'll notice the number 5 shows up everywhere. They always recommend that you consider this as part of the suite of treatments if it's feasible for your site. Pedestrian refuge islands, RRFBs are appropriate here, and pedestrian hybrid beacons can be considered as well. So you want to take a little bit of a closer look to determine which of those, because you can't use both. You can't have RRFBs and hybrid beacons. So you want to take a bit of a closer look to determine which is appropriate for your site. A little more information about some of these treatments, specifically crossing visibility enhancements. If you look at the FHWA step guidance, they go into a lot of detail on this particular set of countermeasures. High visibility crosswalk markings, parking restrictions, as I mentioned, advanced stop or yield markings, also known as shark's teeth in the roadway, and signage as well. Curb extensions, lighting improvements. FHWA has put together a great 2-page tech sheet on all of these different countermeasures, and you can find those on the STEP website. The tech sheet also includes the estimated reduction in pedestrian involved crashes that's sourced from the research. So this particular set of countermeasures can reduce pedestrian crashes by 23 to 48%, depending on conditions. Relating to RRFBs in particular, FHWA also has a great tech sheet on this treatment. So an RRFB is a pedestrian actuated flashing warning sign. These are generally placed on both sides of the roadway. In some cases, they can be placed in a pedestrian refuge median in the middle of the roadway as well, which is especially helpful on multi-lane roads. When are RRFBs appropriate? So FHWA recommends, they say they're more effective on lower speed roadways. They recommend them only when the speed limit is less than 40 miles per hour. They also go on to say they're less effective when sight distance is limited, as I discussed before. Federal Highway says they are particularly effective at multi-lane crossings. And this can be due to challenges crossing a multi-lane road. If you have 4 lanes to cross, you never know if traffic in all 4 lanes is going to stop for you or not. Sometimes you might cross 2 lanes, but then you realize one of the other lanes traffic hasn't stopped for you, and that can be challenging. Further, the New York State DOT Traffic Safety and Mobility Instruction Memo, which is the guidance that we follow here in New York. This memo references the City of Boulder, Colorado's guidance, the pedestrian crossing treatment installation guidelines from 2011. So bear with me here. That guidance document, the NISTOT memo and the City of Boulder memo refer to this chart to determine when RRFBs should be used. So the way you read this chart is, first I'll mention there are 2 versions of this chart, one for low speed roads, which you're seeing here, one for higher speed, 40 mile per hour or greater roads, which looks a little different, and you can find that on the link at the slide, on the bottom of the slide. But the way you read this chart is you look at the major street vehicles per hour, the peak hour traffic volume, and then you look at the number of pedestrian crossings observed as well here on the y-axis. And then depending on where your point lands on the chart, that determines when no treatment is needed for if there's less than 150 vehicles per hour or 1,500 vehicles per day, which you commonly see on a residential road, for example. Then they say no treatment's needed. There's plenty of big breaks in traffic where a pedestrian can safely cross. If there's more volume than that, then you would want to consider an RRFB. If there's even more volume, both vehicle volume and pedestrian volume, then you may land in this green area, which is where you would consider either an RRFB or a hawk signal pedestrian hybrid beacon. As you go further to the right, the higher level countermeasures such as the hawk beacons or a full pedestrian signal would be recommended instead. And then the line on the chart here, that diagonal line, RRFB is not recommended above this line. If there's too much traffic, then you don't want to install an RRFB. If you have a very high volume arterial, 50,000 vehicles a day, you don't want to be interrupting that traffic every minute or two for a pedestrian crossing, that's not recommended. So again, this chart can be found at the link below, and there's a very similar chart for high speed roadways as well. Relating to pedestrian hybrid beacon, so in some cases, you might want to use these in place of an RRFB. However, we don't know of any of these in the Cdtc planning area. Other regions around the country use these pretty commonly, and they show up in a lot of these guidance documents that I've discussed. A pedestrian hybrid beacon, also known as a HAWK, high intensity activated crosswalk beacon. It's not a full traffic signal. It's not a red light, a 3-color signal like you see at every intersection. It's a flashing red that blinks back and forth. It's a little bit like a rail crossing signal. You can see an example photo here on the right side of the slide. So this is pedestrian actuated as well. The lights will blink red, and vehicles are required to stop on red and allow the pedestrians to cross. So as I mentioned, we don't have any of these, we think, in the Cdtc area yet, but we do see them in other regions around the country. For my final slide, I'll just briefly cover steps 5 and 6, which relate to implementation in the 6-step FHWA guide. Step 5 is to consult your local, your design and installation resources, both the federal and the state guidance, which we've covered today. You can refer back to the first 7 slides of this presentation. And finally, step 6 is to identify funding opportunities and to once implemented to actually monitor the performance of the uncontrolled crossing. So Cdtc, as Jennifer mentioned earlier, we have some resources that can help with planning. We have the Cdtc Technical Assistance Program, which I believe Jen will discuss a bit more at the end. And we also have the Cdtc Community and Transportation Linkage Program, which is for larger concept development studies. So we can help if you're interested. Jen will cover these in a bit more detail. And in terms of actually funding RRFBs or other crossing improvements, Highway Safety Improvement Program funds, this is federal funding that flows through Cdtc. So if you speak to us, we may be able to find HSIP funding for your project through our competitive federal funding transportation improvement program process. So that was all I wanted to cover. I know I flew through these, but you can go through any of the guidance documents I shared earlier. I'll just say thank you very much. If you have any questions, please post them in the chat and I'll answer them as well as I can. For now, I'm going to turn things over to Christopher Cornwell and Ryan Walsh from GPI to discuss the implementation side of these uncontrolled crossing locations. So I will end my screen share and turn things over to you, Chris.
Well, thank you, Andrew, for that introduction. Hopefully everyone can be seeing my screen.
Yep, I can see
Awesome.
your title slide.
That's a good first step here. So again, thanks for the lead in on this. And so what Ryan and I are going to walk through today is really just an overview of design and construction, of focusing on RFBs, but also talking about some maintenance, some cost, and really go through some local examples and sort of elaborate on some of the countermeasures that Andrew went through. So I know you can't communicate directly with me, but in the chat, but we'll end with this photo when we get through our presentation. But if anybody knows where that's at, just put that in the chat window. I'm curious to know if anybody is from the local Cdtc region. So if anybody knows where that at, they can feel free to put that in. So with that introduction, I'm going to turn this over to Ryan to sort of lead us through an overview of some RRFBs.
Perfect. Thank you, Chris. So we'll just start with some basics of RRFBs. So rectangular rapid flashing beacons, or RRFBs as we'll refer to them throughout this presentation, are an enhancement to a standard sign and mark crossing that meets the current standards of the MUTCD for signing and striping. The flashing beacons on the assemblies consist of two 5-inch by 2-inch rectangular LEDs, and the beacons flash at 50 millisecond pulses that last the duration set by the designer, which usually is based off of the crossing length. The beacons are normally dark and unnoticeable, as you can see by some of these pictures here when they're off, and they only light up and blink when they are activated by a user hitting the push button. So you may have noticed driving around that RFBs have gained a lot of popularity over the past half decade. And just in my 6 years at GPI Albany, we've spec'd out over RFBs at over 30 different intersections across the state, including the cities of Kingston, Rome, Saratoga, and the town of East Greenbush, just to name a few. And in addition to the several pieces of published guidance and engineering judgment, designers should also take into account the client's preferences and the local community's opinion on potential crossing treatments. And in the bottom right corner, oops, sorry, Chris.
Sorry about that.
You're good. In the bottom right corner is another treatment selection matrix, slightly different than the ones that Andrew had showed previously. And this was the one that was actually in the Empire State Trail Design Guide. And it serves as a good starting point for crossing treatment selection based upon the posted speed limit and the number of travel lanes. So RFBs are a DOT approved item and they fall under the 680-8225 item blanket. The full 8-digit item number is based upon the configuration determined by all of the design considerations. So the X in the item number, that gives the number of beacons to be installed on each assembly. This is typically based upon the roadway geometry and roadway classification. So just as a basic example, for a one-way roadway, you would not put 4 individual beacons, 2 on each side of the assembly. You would only need 2 on one side. And the Y in the item number states that what power supply is to be used. So it's either going to be AC hardwire or it's going to be solar powered. And as Andrew mentioned earlier, TSMI 18-02 issued by DOT has additional guidance that includes the information that Andrew had mentioned earlier. The client will ultimately dictate the power supply to the RRFB, but typically if you are installing the unit on a state route, DOT will require that the RRFB be AC powered, hardwired. And if it's on a local or county road, the unit will most likely be solar powered. Communication between the RRFBs on either side of the roadway is wireless or hardwired. And the AC powered units are typically hardwired while the solar units wirelessly communicate. And right now there are currently 3 different manufacturers that have assemblies that are on the DOT materials approved list. That's Carmana and Tapco and TrafficCom. And here on the left is a screenshot of the approved list from the New York State DOT for RRFB assemblies. When you spec out an RRFB, make sure to always check the approved list, as the approved models and manufacturers can change. And as you can see, Tapco is currently the predominant supplier. They have the most models listed out, and as with many other traffic items and other items, right now the supply chain issues have affected the delivery of RFBs in the past year. And on the right-hand side here is the New York State DOT Special Specification. As a designer, make sure to check the Special Specification every so often, as it is always evolving. And this spec was changed last year in November. The Special Specification will outline the standard requirements of the RFB and the basis of payment, including what is and what is not covered under the item number. And I'll turn this over to Chris.
Thanks, Ryan. So I'm going to go through some specific design details. As Ryan mentioned, the RRFB standard, the 680, has both the text. They also have on the right-hand side, you'll see details. So these don't have to be detailed by the designer. DOT has already done that. And those details go through very specific details, how deep the foundation needs to be, what height pole needs to be put there, and that pole height's dictated based upon if you're using AC powered or solar powered. Also the height of the pedestrian button, which is dictated by your ADA for height. And then also where the actual beacon goes, the solar panel, all of that stuff is called out on those sheets. The other thing that comes up quite frequently is which side of the crossing does the RRFB go on? And to our knowledge, I mean, there's not really clearly defined, but there is a rule of thought. And at least this is how, for the majority of the Empire State Trail, this has been structured in that when you have, especially for a trail, if you have a bicycle rider coming up, you want to make it as easy as possible for that button to be actuated. So we always put it on the right side. That also has the added advantage of, if you can see where my cursor is, of basically freeing up the ADA pad from a line of sight from oncoming traffic. So it sort of serves 2 purposes by putting it on the right side of the pad to basically make it easier for bicycles to hit without, or basically push the button without going to the other side of the trail, and for vehicles to see the user. So I thought it would be good here to show some construction photos of RRFBs going into the ground, and just some of the things that you'll see in the field if you've never seen that before. So in the upper right-hand corner, you can see the foundation going in. This foundation goes into the ground about 6.5 feet with a standard. And it is important to consider, when you're putting these, especially in an urban environment, there's typically a lot of buried utilities that you come across. So you can see here, I believe that's a water line, which it looks like we just barely missed there, but you can see that as a, an important consideration to make sure you include some test pit items to make sure that you can get that adequately in the ground, the foundation. Once that's in place, then if you're doing a hardwired configuration, there could be conduit run to it. There's a rebar cage, there's anchor bolts that go in, and then the concrete is placed. And then typically, depending on, what your ADA pad looks like, in this case, it was a larger pad, the contractor saw cutting out for placement of the concrete ADA pad with the tactile warning. And then the last thing would be pavement restoration and, the striping of the crosswalk. And no, and there's a photo here. This is not snow. It was excessive glass beads put down by our contractor in a high traffic area. But it was a lot of glass beads spread out there. Some additional photos. If you've not seen the inside of one of these, it's pretty cool actually. So this is the inside of a solar powered RRFB. You can see this is your battery here. Then there's basically a board here for all of your relays and communications, and then your controller unit, and this is a TAPCO unit you can see right here, is right here. So there's a screen onto it, and that's where the controls are set with the other unit, and also your timing is set that Ryan mentioned for the duration of the flash. As you can see, this is a new unit, so there's instructions into it and other stuff that were in the actual box itself. On the right-hand side here, this is for an AC or hardwired configuration. You can see there would be an additional box or boxes onto it this is all for your electric controls because it does not run on solar. Also similar to a, your house circuit board, you'll have basically wires running into it and across to the other units. And then also a consideration that for the AC powered units, they will have a meter, and that would have to be something that would have to be coordinated with the local power company for a meter drop. These things typically, because they're only actuated when a user presses a button, they don't use a lot of power. As you can see, I think this is used 3 kilowatt hours, the one I took a picture of, but they do require a meter on them. Maintenance considerations. I think this is something that sometimes does get overlooked when we put stuff and install it from an owner standpoint. Just because we install something, we design, we put it out there, it has a maintenance consideration, and RRFBs are no different. And those basically come from a variety of different issues. You could have vehicle collisions. This is one that we had down in Columbia County where the flashing beacon was actually hit. You can see it. I don't know how they hit that and not the sign, but they did. And then the actual control box has been ripped off of the unit itself. That had to go out and obviously be fixed. These are on a breakaway transformer base, similar to any other pedestrian component for signals. So if it was hit much harder, it probably would have severed that transformer base. The other interesting thing is vandalism. This is Andrew had showed this picture earlier of the Elliott Road crossing in East Greenbush. We found this earlier this spring. The town said, hey, what's going on out here? It looks like kids decided to potentially unbolt the W1115, but they couldn't get the other vandal-proof bolt out. But yeah, so this stuff does happen. The town went out and just fixed it, but it is a consideration for vandalism. The other item is the wireless communications. We've heard of some instances where the wireless communications will lose sync, no different than, a Wi-Fi router in your house would. So that does occur. And then longer duration stuff would be like the life of the battery or the life of the solar panel. Typically we're hearing, typically a 5 to 8 year battery life. And then the solar panel, typically 10 years out of them before they would start, producing less power and aging out. And as I mentioned, all of these for AC power would have an electrical hookup. So there'd be a monthly electrical service charge for these. So those are some ongoing maintenance concerns for consideration. So what do these things cost to install? So what we did was, as Ryan mentioned, we've installed a lot of these in the last few years. So we looked at both the current weighted average and what contractors had bid in the last few years to sort of see where this was going with this. So we looked at the solar powered and the 2 different AC powered units, and we looked at, the solar powered units are typically $8,000 each, and that each meaning you need 2 of these for each intersection. What the cost is on the right is we looked at if you had to do a full upgrade of that intersection with, bringing the ramps in compliance and doing a crosswalk, that would bring that up closer with the 2 RRFBs to around $20,000. So interesting enough, the actual solar powered RRFB is actually a little more expensive than the AC powered one. But what this doesn't factor into is all the other costs with an AC power unit, such as, pull boxes and electrical service connections. So when you add in all of that, an AC powered RRFB is about $5,000 more expensive on average than a solar powered one. And then if you're running everything underground, including the power going to the to everything, that's even more expensive, around $28,000, and that's per crossing. So again, these numbers aren't hard and fast, but they're a good average to give you an idea of what these cost, soup to nuts, to implement these an RRFB control. I want to talk a little bit on refuge islands, and Andrew had talked about these. These are located at the midpoint of a marked crossing. And the idea is they're going to improve safety by allowing pedestrians or bicycles to cross traffic in one direction at a time, and it shortens that overall crossing distance. If we're going to be deploying a refuge island, one of the key factors is making sure there's enough refuge width in the center of that refuge island. And the minimum per FHWA is 8 foot to have in there. And that's really so if you're doing a bicycle, you have enough room so the bicycle is fully within that refuge island. The other item to look at is what's called the offset, which you can see here. Again, this is the photo that was on the cover slide, and you can see it here in plan view. So the idea of this offset refuge island is, as a user walks through here, hits the island, it points the user, as shown by this vision cone, in the direction of traffic. So it basically forces the user to look at oncoming traffic, which helps, basically compliance for both the drivers and the users of the facility. So that is an important countermeasure that's being incorporated into a lot of new refuge islands. It is important, I'll say from past history, that the intent of that refuge island is clearly relayed to both the contractor and your inspection staff, because they could think it's design error, which it clearly is not. So it is important just to make sure everyone is aware of the intent of that is of why we're doing that. Some other considerations for the refuge islands include, making sure you have good lines of sight to the crossing. Also the landscaping, as you can see, sometimes there'll be a hardscape, sometimes they'll have a very low line landscaping, but you don't want to have anything that obstructs the view of a pedestrian or a bicyclist in that refuge island. We also want to make sure everything is fully accessible, from an ADA standpoint. Drainage is another consideration. I mean, typically your road is crowned, but if you have other drainage considerations, like a super elevated road, you're going to want to make sure you look at drainage to make sure we're not creating any drainage issues by doing this. And as I mentioned, the offset design here is not applicable in every case, but where it could be used, it has been found to be highly effective. I do want to touch on trail splitter islands. Sort of an opportunity here to sort of talk about the trail aspect of it. The design intent of using these was an alternative for bollards. Bollards themselves in a trail are a known hazard, and we all know that. So we started leaning towards these splitter islands, and the idea is to discourage vehicular access and slow or separate approaching trail users. And in this case, it was actually an RRFB intersection that we're showing. Originally designed, these have mountable curbing, some type of a hardscape, or it could be a landscaping in here, and they're well striped around. Very interesting enough, over the last year, we've installed hundreds of these things for trail projects. We were finding these things could not, for some users, especially bike users, could not be clearly seen the difference of that vertical change, and we were having some accidents that occurred. So we are making recommendations now that solution is, in the case of the Albany Hudson Electric Trail, that we've installed flexible delineators on these now to help define that that splitter island better. So that is a consideration for any owners with splitter islands, just to keep that in mind. Just want to show some general pictures of some RRFB installations around the capital region. So again, you can see different uses of refuge islands. Different ornamental poles can also be utilized with these instead of the galvanized poles. This is an AC powered unit. There's no solar panel versus the this one, which actually has a solar panel. You see, it's a higher pole that we would have out there. Here's some more general installation photos. This was a project we did down in the city of Kingston. I show it because it's got a lot of cool stuff going on, and that we incorporated, we have a cycle track here, which actually is part of the Empire State Trail for a piece of it through the city of Kingston, with buffered buffered parking protecting that, but we also have solar actuated RRFBs along the corridor. So it's just a way these can be incorporated into your streetscape design, again, with fluted poles that match all the lighting and also all the signals that were in the corridor. And specifically, I'm going to look at the Albany Hudson Electric Trail and show some before and after photos of where we installed these. This is back at Elliott Road. So this was a before photo, before the trail was built, and the after photo. So A, dramatic change of the corridor, and B, you can sort of see how we implemented the splitter island, the RRFB solar operated. It's placed on the right side of the trail coming out for bicyclists to press the button. And then we've also deployed the countermeasures for the flexible delineators. Another before and after shot. This was down on 203 in North Chatham. This was a very, the trail actually went through this intersection, but it was a very screwy intersection. It was an old Y intersection configuration. We looked at a lot of different alternatives with the community of North Chatham based upon its history and what they wanted to see from traffic calming. We ended up coming up with a T intersection for that design with a splitter island. So this reflects that design treatment through there. So you can again see the RRFB. This was a AC powered unit, being that we were on New York State DOT right away. And this is a shot down on New York 20 in Nassau. So you can see the before shot looking across and the after shot. And this was a case of where we had very confined utilities and conflicts. So we actually had to basically take the push button to meet our ADA accessibility guidelines and put it on a separate push button pole. That's why I wanted to show this one. So there are different arrangements that you can do with that based upon your site. Again, that gets that button back on the right side so bicycle users can press it as they cross. Just talk briefly about some enhanced countermeasures to elaborate on what Andrew discussed earlier. New York State DOT TSMI 1603 talks about retro reflective signpost strips. You'll see those going up. Those are those highly visible yellow strips that go up. They're a pretty low cost countermeasure item that really enhances both for your crossing signs and stop signs. It really enhances the visibility of those. And then DOT TSMI 1707 talks about doing the double signage and also the double post, which are shown here, which again gives you two posts to put your reflective sign strips on, which really enhances your sign, especially at a crossing. These are pretty low cost controls, just over $200 to install. The only caveat I would say is if you're in a highly visible, sensitive area and you install these high vis yellow signs and double post reflective signposts, you may get some pushback from the community of the brightness out there, just from experience. So just something to keep in mind depending on where these are being deployed. And then to sort of talk about the future of where we're at. Right now, as we've discussed, RRFBs are only actuated by the user by pressing a button. And it's only effective if the user presses the button. And what we find is we're trying to make it as easy as possible for them to do, but they don't get triggered by a lot of bicycle riders. So we are working with the Hudson River Valley Greenway as part of the overall Empire State Trail initiative to look at a basically potential study with DOT traffic safety on use of passive detection devices. Those could consist of devices such as thermal, infrared, cameras, etc., to see if we can incorporate those specifically with the RRFBs. We have deployed devices. If you ride the Albany Hudson Electric Trail crossing Route 4, which is a fully signalized crossing for a pedestrian, we have actually put loops in the trail, and they actually are shown to be very effective. As a bicycle approaches, it would actually trigger it, and the light is already red by the time you get there. So, but things like this don't pick up pedestrians. So we're looking at different ways of incorporating technology into these devices. And again, these aren't looking to replace the push button, but they are looking to see if we can make these more effective. So hopefully in the coming years, more will come. Currently, none of this, besides the loops for signals, obviously, but none of this is approved by the DOT. And I do want to talk a little bit about raised crosswalks, raised intersections, etc. Probably everyone's somewhat familiar with these. Basically, the idea is by raising up the crosswalk, and these can be used at a regular crosswalk or an RRFB crosswalk, it basically decreases the vehicle's speed. They're not a speed hump. Basically, you have an 8-foot rise over that or 8-foot run over that 4-inch rise, but it does effectively slow vehicles down. You can also incorporate the curb extensions or bump outs that Andrew discussed. Just some considerations to keep in mind, especially with the municipalities. Drainage is a big concern. If you're doing new construction, you can incorporate your drainage basins into this. If you're doing a retro installation, like on a PSAP project, there are treatments that you can keep the gutter flow line going, but it does need to be clearly reviewed so you're not creating ponding issues out there. Snow plowing is also another thing that comes up a lot with municipalities of how do we snow plow these. I can say from experience, there was a lot of hesitation and concern with these. They haven't proved to really, once the municipalities were maintaining them for a few years, they really didn't have that much concern snow plowing them. Noise, though, is a consideration. If you decide to put these in front of, say, a residential house or in a residential neighborhood, you will have trucks and cars slowing for them, speeding up after them, mufflers rattling going across them in the middle of the night. So noise could come up in a public involvement setting on these type of treatments. And then lastly, sort of end here on the next step or the enhancement. And Andrew talked about the HAWK, or that high intensity activated crosswalk, otherwise known as the pedestrian hybrid beacon. And really, what's the difference versus the fully pedestrian actuated signal? And we could spend a whole another hour just talking about these, and that could be another topic for a later day. But as Andrew mentioned, the HAWKs really haven't been deployed, at least in this area. They are really that next step above the RRFB, and if you can't get the warrants to put in a fully actuated signal. So to put in that fully signal, you're going to have all your signal warrants met, and that does become somewhat difficult in some areas. But our experience shows that if you can meet all the warrants for a full signal, it's probably warranted to go to that full signal. We had proposed use of a HAWK on the US Route 4 crossing in East Greenbush. We actually had 2 public meetings on that. There was a lot of hesitation by the town board and by the DOT Region 1 and by the general public of just a lack of understanding of the HAWK, realizing was it going to get good conformance, especially with the traffic volumes on Route 4. So the end result of that was we ended up putting out a fully actuated signal by doing the warrant analysis to meet that. So I think you will see HAWKs incorporated into stuff, but it's a very unique application where they can be deployed. And with that, I will turn that back over to you, Andrew or Jen, and we'll close.
Thank you, Chris, and Ryan and Andrew. So we're going to jump back to, hopefully I get this right. Everyone can see my slide. Yes, great. So Andrew briefly talked about some of the planning and funding resources here at Cdtc, and I just wanted to mention some specific funding opportunities that could assist with pedestrian safety planning in your community. Cdtc partners with the Capital District Regional Planning Commission on a community planning technical assistance program. We accept applications for that on a rolling basis. It's currently open. These are for small scale planning assistance and data collection and mapping projects. Stephen's putting links to these program web pages in the chat. Also, our community and transportation linkage program, which we do a solicitation once a year for this. These are for larger transportation planning studies, usually up to $100,000. And we anticipate that we would be doing a solicitation for these towards the end of this calendar year. Similarly, the next Unified Planning Work Program solicitation will be this fall. Towards the end of this calendar year. We don't have a funding limit for that, but if there is a planning need in the region, that is the time for local municipalities to apply or submit a proposal for funding. Also, the Capital Coexist Traffic Safety Ambassador Grant Program. This is a really small scale traffic safety program It's really for like demonstration projects or pop-up safety events. And the max grant amount is $5,000. This is also currently open and we're accepting applications on a rolling basis. And lastly, there have been a number of new federal funding programs as a result of the bipartisan infrastructure law. And Cdtc has developed a web page that kind of outlines all the different programs and some of the specifics for either New York or for our region where applicable. We are trying to track all these as they're announced and information is released, but they have been coming out quickly. We've been trying to keep our web page updated, but if you may find other information on the USDOT website. So all of the links to these programs I mentioned are in the chat. Thank you, Stephen, for that. So with that, I want to thank all of our panelists today and open it up to questions. You can put it in the chat, use the Q&A, or raise your hand and we would be happy to unmute you.
So to kick us off, asked if the solar-powered beacons performed well. Maybe the folks from GPI have some insight on the performance of the solar-powered beacons.
Yeah, I can take that one. So we've had solar installations that date back to probably 2014. So that was like the older version of the spec that I can recall. And I know they are still working today. Actually, those three were out in the city of Rome. So I know they get a lot of snow and cold out there. So I don't know if the city has actually replaced the batteries. But like I said, those are the two real consumable items, the batteries and the solar panels on those.
We have a question from Ed. So he came in a little bit late, but he's interested in what are the compliance rate with the beacons, and I guess for people in the intersection, and then for people waiting to cross the intersection. And is there a need related to that? Is there a need for greater public education when installing these?
Did you want to take anything on that, Andrew, or you want me to?
No, you can go ahead.
And don't exactly quote me on this, but I believe the FHWA study references it showed about 80% compliance rate over a non-RFB intersection. So they have been shown to be highly effective. I can say in my views, and I've looked at a lot of RFBs installation. Yes, there is a public education component that needs to go with these, especially in a municipality. Typically, your chronic abusers would be your locals that use this every day. So I think any type of a installation should go with some type of a roadside campaign to help with education of what you actually do at these. So I think that is a good item that was brought up by Ed.
Yeah, and I'll mention in terms of compliance of vehicles stopping for pedestrians when the beacons are actuated or when the RRFBs are actuated. I think as these become more common in the area, then I think compliance, we would expect it to increase. This is highly regional, with some regions of the country have deployed a lot of these and deployed a lot of hawk beacons. So drivers are familiar with them and there's some expectation of what to do. But as they're deployed around here, if you see a new one pop up in your town, it might be the only one that you've ever experienced. So you might not be sure what to do. So education and outreach, very important. And hopefully as these become more common, compliance will continue to increase.
Ed has a quick follow-up about rear end collisions. Do we see an uptick in rear end collisions with RRFBs? Is that a phenomenon that's been documented? And if so, to what extent?
I don't have any statistics on that could support that. It would be an interesting follow-up to see if that has resulted in any. I mean, keep in mind that the RFBs, you still have your advanced posting coming to that, your W1115, so it is posted. But I don't have any data. That would be an interesting discussion to see if there is any rear end additional accidents that may occur.
Yeah, I didn't come across that as well, but my impression is that might have been a crash that would have occurred regardless of the RRFB. If someone were yielding to a pedestrian at a marked crossing, whether or not there was an RRFB, if they chose to come to a stop where they should to yield to the pedestrian and they got rear-ended, you know, I don't think the RRFB would increase the frequency of that kind of accident. I think that's carelessness on the fault of the second vehicle behind, following too close, you know, because you're supposed to yield to pedestrians regardless of if there's an RRFB or a pedestrian hybrid beacon or any other treatment out there. So I would say in that case, the first vehicle did the right thing.
Any other questions? Please raise your hand, type it into the Q&A or into the chat, whichever works for you.
And I do want to say, for anyone wondering, the photo that I never said where that was at. So that is New York 50 or Boston Avenue in the city of Saratoga Springs, just in case anyone was wondering on that.
So John has a quick question. If vehicle speeds are exceeding 45 miles an hour, do you use a hawk in lieu of the RRFB? I'm sure somewhere in those guides there was some sort of answer to that, but I'm assuming it related to the volumes, but I'll let you guys take that.
Yeah, the guidance I've seen, the higher the speed, the less you want to rely on RRFBs, and the more you want to consider either a hawk or a full signal head. I believe the guidance from Federal Highway says if it's 40 miles per hour or more, then you shouldn't use an RRFB. Or maybe in rare cases of maybe 2-lane roads, for example. If we take a look at that countermeasure selection chart that I shared, that was referenced by the NICE memo from the city of Boulder, that in some cases, if the speed limit is 40 miles per hour or greater, they can still be considered as a treatment. But kind of the area of that chart that's covered by RRFBs shrinks as the speed goes up, and you do want to, for the higher speed conditions, you do want to consider either the hawks or the full signals more.
All right, so Jacob is asking, in the passive activation studies, what sources and places are you looking at that have successful ways of detecting pedestrians and triggering the signals? He's saying that there's other countries that have very tight integration of walking and biking lanes with its driving lanes.
Yeah, I can take that for Jacob. So we are looking at what came to mind was, you know, when we had looked locally in the country, like in Cape Cod, they've really implemented a few systems. I think they're using FLIR cameras for this, which seem to work very good. But it is a good point that other countries have, you know, moved this technology along, and this technology does exist and is used in other states. So just a matter of, you know, doing more of a proof of study, and what the discussion item has been with DOT is they do allow some experimental type of installations to be done. So that is sort of the route we're going with this, working through the Hudson River Valley Greenway. I know we're still waiting to get some feedback from DOT, but would utilize some experimental funding to install these, and do those follow-up studies, and also do some research on where these have been installed in other states and other countries.
All right, so Chaim has got a quick question about, he's seen some RRFBs in New York that are sensor actuated. Is that based on old guidance that doesn't apply today?
Well, I would say it probably, the project wasn't funded through a DOT source of funding, unless it was an experimental funding, because to our knowledge, it isn't there isn't a DOT approved item for that yet. But I would be interested to know if you could let us know where you've seen those. I would love to know exactly where those are at, just to do some additional research.
And I've also just dropped the link to the City of Boulder pedestrian treatment installation guidelines for those who want to do a quick check on that. And again, we will post both of the decks later on to where that is accessible for everyone. We've got one more question. It's how about a 2-lane road, midblock crossing with 85th percentile, 51 miles an hour. So I'm assuming they're saying that that is the prescriptive 51. I guess they're asking if it's appropriate.
Yeah, that's a pretty high speed. So that's kind of off the chart. I guess that's literally off the chart that I was showing you earlier, Federal Highways chart, which goes up to 40 miles per hour or greater. So at that speed, I think RRFBs are generally not recommended, and you do want to consider at least the pedestrian hybrid beacon instead, the Hawk signal, or a full, if warranted by the traffic volume and the crossing volume, then you can put in a full signal instead. That's pretty high speed, so you also need to calculate what your stopping sight distance is, and for a speed like that, you might need a very high stopping distance, some hundreds of maybe 500 feet or more. And so in that case, you want to make sure that there's proper visibility of the crosswalk for the proper sight stopping distance on coming from both directions. I don't know if Chris, if you have any experience installing crossings on these higher speed roadways.
So if I'll go back to, we worked with the New York State Thruway on the, again, this was the Empire State Trail for the crossing of the Berkshire Spur that goes along 203. If you're familiar with that area, when there is a RRFB, and I believe the speed there, I believe was 45 miles an hour. We ended up doing an enhancement. Those have actual as double RFBs, so the advanced RFBs, where your advanced signage goes, are also triggered also. So again, it was an additional mitigation that we had to do. But the caveat is 203 has a very low AADT traffic-wise, even though it has a higher speed. So the traffic volume, as Andrew mentioned, does come into play on this also. So I think it would have to be further looked at, but I would agree with Andrew that that's on the higher range of the speed that an RRFB would be able to be installed on.
Something I didn't mention, but does come up in the federal guidance, is sometimes grade separation is recommended in very extreme cases. Obviously, if you're crossing, a highway or something, interstate highway where pedestrians don't belong, or a very high volume or high speed roadway, then in those extreme cases, Federal Highway might say, don't put in an at-grade crossing at all. Put in a pedestrian bridge instead. Do a grade separated crossing. That's obviously the most costly countermeasure. So it's only used in rare cases like that, but it does come up in the guidance.
Chaim is following up and saying that those previously, the censored ones that he was previously viewed were at the Binghamton University campus. So there probably was not involving DOT funding.
That is, but yeah, that's good recon though. If I'm down there, I will check those out on the campus. That is good to know.
Absolutely. Well, if we don't have any other questions, I think I'll hand it to Jen to just wrap us up real quick.
Sure. So thank you again to all our panelists, and thank you to everyone attending today. We will have attendance certificates out for your CM credits by the end of the week. You can always reach out to us with additional questions, follow us on social media, and we hope to see you next month for our next webinar. So have a good rest of your day and good rest of your week. Bye, everyone.